racial justice, and you might say roots all of these interconnected issues into a discussion of the historical and contemporary issues of racism and bias in American agriculture. There are 3 distinguished panelists from around the country who will be presenting. We are going to be showing a video of a presentation that was presented live on September 3rd. And Pastor Nancy and I were so impressed with that presentation that we said, my goodness, we need to bring that to our community, because it was a relatively restricted group of legal and agricultural folks who had come together for that presentation. And I think it's especially timely that we're showing this now in November, which is recognized as Native American Heritage Month. And we're all quite aware of the land loss that Indigenous peoples, as well as people of color, have suffered and continue to suffer, that this is a major concern and it needs a lot more attention. So after this evening, we'll all know a lot more about many of these interconnected issues. And I think it's also worth mentioning that here in Vermont, anyway, we are on unceded Indigenous land of the Abenaki people. And so we should always be mindful of that. Again, as tonight's program was previously recorded live, there may be occasional issues of image instability. There's nothing that we can do about that, but fortunately the audio remains stable throughout. There will be 45 minutes of presentation from the individual panelists, and then a moderator from the law school will facilitate a conversation among the panelists, and then we will get into our community discussion. And finally, for those of you who may be wondering, what's the connection to faith and spirituality? Why are we doing this as an organization of interfaith power and light? And I was reading last night in the book, Becoming Wise by Krista Tippett, and happened upon a conversation she had with the late Vincent Harding, who his daughter, Rachel Harding, happens to be a friend of mine. And Vincent was speaking about Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., of course, perhaps the best known and most beloved civil rights leader. And I think we all know that his activism was deeply rooted in his spiritual life and religious beliefs. So it's just a reminder that all of these issues do come together, and we can look at them in an integrated, intersectional way, and that's probably our best way forward. So again, we thank you for joining us. We invite you to please mute your microphones. Any comments and questions can be posted in the chat box. Our president, Ron McGarvey, will be collecting those questions and facilitating our conversation after the presentation. And I guess that's it, unless there's anything I might be forgetting, Ron or Sam. Without further ado, Sam, take it away.
Good evening and welcome everyone to Rooting Out Structural Racism in American Agriculture, which is tonight's installment of Vermont Law School's Embedded Racism in the Law panel series. Tonight we have a very distinguished panel that I am thrilled to be able to host. And I'd like to thank them all for joining us tonight. We have Sherri White-Williamson, who is the Environmental Justice Policy Director of the North Carolina Conservation Network and a Vermont Law School graduate. We have Stephen Carpenter, who is the Deputy Director and Senior Staff Attorney at Farmers Legal Action Group. And we have Monica Armster Rainge, who's the Director of Land Retention and Advocacy at the Federation of Southern Cooperatives Land Assistance Fund. My name is Emily Spiegel. I'll be moderating this evening, and I'm an assistant professor in the Center for Agriculture and Food Systems at Vermont Law School, or CAFS. CAFS trains law and policy students to develop real-world solutions for a more sustainable and just food system. And we do that through offering both master's and LLM degrees in food and agriculture law and policy, as well as concentrations in food and agriculture law for JD students. But we're also a center for research and advocacy. We work with partners to develop legal tools and policy recommendations that address food system challenges. And in our food system, as elsewhere in our society, enduring racism is one of the most entrenched challenges that we face. That's why we're thrilled to be able to host this panel tonight, to be able to unpack what some of those enduring issues are and to talk about possible solutions and opportunities for working toward change. I want to note briefly that we're not going to be covering every source of racism in the law governing the food system tonight. There are many issues we could cover, starting from the very origins of this country, and in particular, land taken from indigenous peoples, labor taken from enslaved people. From the origins of this country onward, there are many instances of racism through the food system. But tonight, we're going to discuss a series of historical and contemporary agriculture-related issues that particularly affect Black farmers, eaters, and rural residents, as well as other people of color. And our experts here with us tonight have many years of experience working in anti-racism legal work in the food system. So our format tonight will include a few introductory remarks from each of our panelists, and then we'll have a moderated discussion followed by question and answers from the audience. People are welcome to send in questions anytime tonight as we go along, and we'll get to them at the end of the evening. For anyone who's tuning in for the first time to ask questions, if you're viewing this on the Vermont Law School live page, which is vermontlaw.edu/live, you can hover over the video player and click on the comment icon in the top right corner. That'll open up a comment box for you to post your question. If you're joining us through Facebook, you can post your questions directly in the comments, and we'll see those too. All right, so each of tonight's speakers has a list of accomplishments that could last us the rest of the night, but in the interest of spending more of our time tonight actually hearing directly from them, I'm going to introduce them just very briefly. And Sherri, I'll start with you. As Environmental Justice Policy Director at the North Carolina Conservation Network, Sherri White-Williamson leads the organization's efforts to connect impacted community-led campaigns and organizations with decision makers. Prior to joining the NC Conservation Network, Sherri worked at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency in the Office of Environmental Justice, where she managed the Federal Interagency Working Group on Environmental Justice and the National Environmental Justice Advisory Council. Sherri also currently serves as a board member of the Rural Empowerment Association for Community Health, also called REACH. She has recently co-founded an environmental organization that will focus on environmental justice, working to build sustainable communities. And in her spare time, which I can scarcely believe she has, Sherri enjoys baking, DIY projects, and playing with her dogs. So Sherri, can you please tell us a little bit more about your background and how it is that you see agriculture fitting into the field of environmental justice?
Thanks, Emily, for having me tonight. It's a pleasure to be talking with the students at Vermont Law and the other listeners here. I am originally from North Carolina, and I'm actually living in North Carolina again now, obviously, and I'm in rural North Carolina. I am in the second largest hog producing county in the United States. We have a Smithfield processing plant here in my hometown. The board that I sit on in Duplin County is in the county that is the #1 hog producing county in the United States. So all around me, I have issues related to environmental justice, and it's all agricultural. So tonight I wanted to focus on the relationship between the two, because I'm sure many people on this call are asking themselves what in the world could possibly be the relationship between agriculture and environmental justice. I want to start talking about that with looking at two definitions. First, the one that's most universally accepted, which is the definition from the Environmental Protection Agency, which defines environmental justice as the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. As I said, that's the most formally accepted definition across the federal agencies and even in state agencies, if you look at state documents describing environmental justice. But the one I want to really bring attention to, since we're talking about racism tonight, is the recognition across pretty much all territories and areas is that what we're experiencing and have been experiencing is environmental racism. And the person that I looked to who defined that was Dr. Ben Chavis in 1987 during the Warren County protest back that brought environmental justice to the forefront. And he defined environmental racism as racial discrimination that's deliberately targeting ethnic and minority communities for exposure to toxic and hazardous waste sites and facilities, coupled with the systemic exclusion of minorities in environmental policymaking, enforcement, and remediation. I'm using those two definitions just to say that when we look at environmental justice, we have to look at it as a systemic system of denying and taking away of rights and wealth from folks, especially as it relates to agriculture. When we look at agriculture, in order to understand the systemic racism, we really have to look at agriculture from almost the beginning of the development or establishment of the United States. Some years ago, I read a book entitled Race and Races, Cases and Resources for a Diverse America. And there was one sentence in there that stood out to me that said, "This history of land ownership in America is a history of taking land from its occupants and giving it to the conquerors." And if you think about history, that's exactly what has happened here in America. The original landowners were the Native Americans in the country. Obviously, that land was taken from them. The Jamestown Company then, through a charter, gave the land to the Virginia Company of London. And over time, that land was then given back to people who were brought here either as indentured servants or as headright owners. Headright owners actually got land straight out, 50 acres each. If you were an indentured servant, you came to the country, you got land, but you didn't actually own the land. You were expected to work for a certain amount of time to basically serve your time out, and then you were entitled to get something from the land. And as we know, land means wealth. If you don't have wealth, then you don't have anything to transfer. And what we talk about often in environmental justice is generational wealth. So we've had a problem with generational wealth for a long time. The indentured system turned into a system of slavery as the colonists started bringing over slaves so that they could have a system of free workforce in the United States. That workforce lasted obviously until the Civil War. And then post-Civil War, you had a different situation of freed slaves, but freed slaves who owned nothing, who had and were at the beck and call pretty much of the Union Army, who had taken the land away from the slave owners. During that time, General William Sherman, who was in charge of the Union forces, had taken land and given it to the United States, the land that belonged to the slave owners. That land was then given to those freed slaves so that they would at least have something to live on and hopefully subsist. it was about 400,000 acres of land, and that land was divided up into 40 acres per freed slave family. Later on, there was another order that gave, as the Army had them available, mules to those families who had those 40 acres. So thus comes the term 40 acres and a mule. But it was in less than a year that President Andrew Johnson then took that land back from the slaves and gave it back to the landowners who promised fealty to the United States. So here again, we have land being given and land being taken back. And of course, the conquerors are the ones who end up with all of the authority and the power to rule the land. So after the land was taken and we had not basically a slave system again, but a system of tenement farming and sharecropping. Tenement farmers were a little bit better off than sharecroppers because they at least were able to lease land and pay the rent. They sold the crops and paid the rent back to the farmer that they were renting the land from. Sharecroppers were basically slaves. Although they were not called slaves, they didn't own anything. They worked the land for free. And it was up to the owner of the land at the end of the year to sell the crop that they raised and then give them money back if there was money left over for them to have to live off of. The sad part of that story often was that the landowner claimed that they had either not made any money or that they had gone into a deficit situation. And so the sharecropper found himself continuing to work from year to year to try to work that debt off. At that point in time, once we got to that point, if you looked at land ownership, those freed slaves and descendants of those freed slaves who still existed had about 19 million acres of land. By 1910, there was only about 14% of all farmers who were Black, and that accounted for about 218,000 farmers. And they were mostly in southern states, Mississippi, Alabama, North Carolina, and South Carolina. And I'm sure some of the other panelists will talk a little bit more about what that really meant and how that has evolved over time. By 1997, ownership had dropped to 2.4 million acres owned by Black farmers. And by 2007, there was only about 1.5% of farmland that was owned by Black farmers. All of this was a result of systemic racism, of various laws that were passed to prevent Black farmers from owning land or from continuing to own land. Part of that had to do with the system of racism that was established within the U.S. Department of Agriculture through the Farm Service Agency, and required farmers to appear before a county commission, which was predominantly composed of white businessmen in the community who oftentimes made the decisions that were adverse to these growers. And thus we began seeing another problem with farmers losing land, the little land that they had, as a result of a system that was stacked up against them in every possible way. So if someone thinks about the relationship between environmental justice and agriculture, that is how they should think of it. It was a system of giving and taking. It was a system of setting up barriers so that if Black farmers or low-income white farmers own land, it was going to be difficult for them to either hold on to the land or for them to purchase land or buy land if they were able to get it. So when you're in a system like that, where there is systemic racism and the wealth, which is the land, is taken away from you, you don't have generational wealth that you can pass on to future family members. And if you don't have that wealth, then you're in a system that is going to take advantage of you and target you in every possible way. And as we see with environmental justice, those folk are the same folks who get the toxic chemicals dumped in their communities and the landfills and all of the other things, the CAFOs, or the concentrated animal feeding operations that we see here in the area that I live in, and nothing good ever comes from that for those communities. And I'll be happy to talk more about this when you open up for questions and answers.
All right, thank you, Sherri, for that introduction. I think that was a really stellar overview of the context, the historical context, and how that ties into experiences that folks are still living today as well. So thank you. Next up, we have Stephen Carpenter, who is a Deputy Director and Senior Staff Attorney at Farmers Legal Action Group, or FLAG. FLAG is a nonprofit law firm that works on behalf of family farmers. Stephen is a graduate of Drury College in Springfield, Missouri, and of Stanford Law School. And at Stanford, Stephen was active in the East Palo Alto Community Law Project, was a Stanford Law Review Executive Editor, and received a Skadden Foundation Fellowship that brought him to FLAG in 1993. At FLAG, Stephen's work is centered on discrimination in agricultural lending, debtor-creditor issues, disaster assistance, federal farm programs, sustainable agriculture and direct marketing, and the problems of farmers contracting for livestock production. He served as senior counsel in the Office of the Monitor in the Pigford case, and is at present the court-appointed ombudsman for the In Re Black Farmers discrimination case. Stephen has conducted frequent FLAG trainings for farmers, advocates, and attorneys, and has spoken to farmers and their advocates in more than 40 states. He has authored and edited several FLAG publications as well. Stephen is also on the board of directors for the Twin Cities Agricultural Land Trust and has been an adjunct professor at the University of Minnesota Law School. So welcome, Stephen. And can you please tell us a little bit more about your background as well, and in particular about your role in the Pigford cases and the law and policy context that led to them?
Sure. It's really a privilege to be here and to be on this panel in particular. And thank you so much for the opportunity to chat. I wanted to say, first of all, though, that as I'm speaking really for myself, I mean, I'm a long-standing attorney at Farmers Legal Action Group, but especially once we talk about possible policy changes in the future, I think it might be clear that I need to say I'm speaking for myself, not FLAG. But that said, I thought Sherri just did a great job talking about sort of the underlying background of race and agriculture, in particular for African Americans. I wanted to add just a quick thought. There's an interesting symmetry here when you think about environmental justice and environmental issues. You know, we have tended to think about environmental problems as being industrial, and actually the biggest, a very substantial contributor to environmental problems has been agriculture, which has largely been given a pass. And similarly, when we think about civil rights and civil rights activism in the United States, we tend not to think about agriculture. And when we think, I mean, if you're in the farm world, predominantly that world doesn't really think about civil rights as being an important issue. So there's sort of a funny way in which agriculture is implicated in environment, in racial justice, in ways which maybe not be surpassed by any other part of the society, yet it sometimes feels, to me at least, as if it's ignored. One thing I might add to Sherri's really good discussion of slavery and its aftermath, if you just take very rough numbers, and you can say at the beginning of the Depression, there were 6 million farmers in the United States, and about 1 million of them were African American. And since in that next 50 or 60 years, you just had mass eradication of farming by Black people. And so granted, a lot of white farmers lost their land too, but the number of total farmers went from 6 to 2 million. That means that if the proportion of Black farmers had remained the same, we would still have 350,000 Black farmers. And that may be 10 times what we actually have. And that doesn't occur without structural embedded racism, which is our topic. I worked hard on 2 of the discrimination cases against the U.S. Department of Agriculture. We could talk about those a little bit more, but one of the things that I think is very striking about them is that these cases involved individual determinations by claimants in the class. And so if anyone ever doubts that there's discrimination going on in agriculture in the last 30 years, let me tell you it this way. When farmers and people who attempted to farm filed their claims in these various cases, they were able to demonstrate to a court-appointed neutral that there was substantial evidence of discrimination. And very, very roughly 40,000 people were able to do that. So to put it a different way, an objective, unbiased observer, when presented with documents from both sides, 40,000 times found that there was substantial evidence of discrimination in just 15 years, beginning in the early 80s. And so those cases have their merits and their demerits. It's worth saying that in the end, you roughly had about $3 billion change hands. That's good. You saw almost no institutional reform at the U.S. Department of Agriculture, which remains in many people's eyes the bad name it once got, the last plantation. And so that's our sort of general background and the background of this litigation. If it's people don't realize this, what's the biggest civil rights case in the history of the United States in terms of dollar value? Actually, like the top 3 are all farm cases. So when the law has actually functioned in a way where litigation has been possible, it's been quite clear that the discrimination has been systematic, ongoing, and extremely effective in denying people opportunities. I will turn it back to you, Emily.
Thank you, Stephen. Can I just ask for a quick follow-up for some of our viewers who might not already be familiar with the Pigford cases? Could you maybe just lay out a little bit of the background there?
So these are class action cases. None of them went to trial. They all were settled. And in all of them, the class, for 2 of the cases, it was African American farmers. For 1, it was Native producers, and for 1, it was Hispanic and women farmers. And they had sort of different trajectories in terms of how they ended up getting settled. But in each of them, except for the Hispanic and women farming cases, people were given the opportunity to file a claim with an independent set of adjudicators where they were able to try to show that there was discrimination. And if they succeeded, they received a $50,000 cash payment plus $12,500 that went towards the tax consequences of that award. So basically what these cases did was gave people a chance to show that there was discrimination, and if they were able to do that, they got $50,000. It didn't do institutional reform of USDA, it didn't get people's land back, it gave them a cash settlement. And as I say, between all of these cases, you're talking about 30 or 40,000 people that were able to prevail. Does that help?
Thank you. I think so, but if we could go back one more time, one step farther back. You mentioned
Sure.
the ties with people losing their land. Can you tell us a little bit about what people were claiming, what was happening that that prompted these massive class action cases, and how does that tie with the loss of land?
So Monica and Sherri, please jump in on this too. But what happens in agriculture is that the natural world requires there to be a very long cycle of production, except for a few things like, say, dairy. What's happening is that you are spending time and effort and resources early in the year, and you don't get paid until your crop comes in later. So almost by definition, almost every farmer in this country borrows money seasonally. And there's nothing more open to exploitation and cheating than a borrower-lender relationship. And as Sherri was describing with sharecropping, that can exactly be what happens. And USDA had what could have been and should have been a really good program to help lend money to farmers who needed it, who couldn't borrow elsewhere. And so USDA actually became a very substantial lender, both for the sort of operating loans that I just described, as well as for land ownership loans to try to get people started. And what happened was you have a very decentralized bureaucracy. So every county has a USDA office. Sherri described these county committees where you had people, what do you know? Southern white planters that were on these county committees in Alabama and Mississippi. And those very dispersed rural bureaucrats essentially were able to replicate the culture surrounding them and to discriminate on a mass and systematic way, which essentially drove people out of farming and took their land and guaranteed that they could fail, that they would fail.
That's absolutely true. I actually worked in a congressional office during that point in time, and we started hearing from farmers who were complaining about the process. I had the opportunity to go to some of those hearings, and it was generally the white business owners, the banker, the county commissioner, who were not accountable to the Farm Service Agency, who were making the decisions. And even if they decided in favor of a grower, oftentimes the loans came midway through the season. As Stephen was saying, they start and plan early. And if you get your loan midway through the season, it's too late to buy the seed, it's too late to plant. And oftentimes farmers would try to compensate. They might clear another acre of land to be able to make it through a season, which disabled them in their ability to continue farming the land that they had, and oftentimes they lost it through many of those decisions and the systemic racism that existed during that time.
I would just add one more little slice to it. One of the things that we're trying to get at today is sort of long-term structural and systematic racism. And one of the interesting things that happens in agriculture that I think sheds light on this nature of the problem is that this idea that you're going to democratize the county committees seems on paper really good. And this happened decades ago. So you had an election. Well, maybe in Iowa or Minnesota, it kind of works to have farmers vote to see who goes on this county committee. And sort of in a purely liberal procedural way, it seemed fair, I guess. But in real life, where you pretend that racism and racial inequalities don't exist by just saying, okay, we're going to have an election, what happens is that even a democratic process serves to reinforce structural inequality and racism in these county committees. And so when we're trying to get at real structural injustice, we have to make sure we go past sort of seemingly colorblind procedures.
Thank you, Stephen. I think that's a really key point, and one I hope that we'll come back to throughout this evening as well. First, I'd like to give a few minutes for Monica to introduce herself. And Monica Armster Rainge serves as the Director of Land Retention and Advocacy for the Federation of Southern Cooperatives Land Assistance Fund in East Point, Georgia. She leads the development and management of high-quality outreach and technical assistance programs that support regional land retention and advocacy initiatives. She also directs the Federation's Regional Ayers Property and Mediation Center, which provides USDA certified mediation services in Georgia, Mississippi, and Louisiana. Monica's experience in agricultural policy development and advocacy she has become one of the nation's most well-respected thought leaders on farm bill policies, which advance equity for socially disadvantaged farmers and ranchers. And the Federation of Southern Cooperative Land Assistance Fund, with its partners, in fact, led advocacy leading to the first ever heirs property legislation in the 2018 Farm Bill, which I hope we'll talk about. Attorney Rainge serves as an executive board member of the National Family Farm Coalition and also serves on the boards of Farmers Legal Action Group and Agricultural Missions Incorporated. She served as the inaugural chair of the Florida Agricultural and Mechanical University Brooksville Agricultural and Environmental Research Station Advisory Committee, where she led the strategic planning process for the university's historic development of 3,800 acres of land in Brooksville, Florida. And she earned her Bachelor of Science degree in Agricultural Business from Florida Agricultural and Mechanical University and a JD from the University of Florida. She also has a Master of Laws in Agricultural Law from the University of Arkansas School of Law's graduate program in agricultural law. So, Monica, can you please tell us about your background next? And Stephen has introduced one of the main causes of Black land loss throughout the past 100 years in the United States, but you work very closely on another one of the main causes, which is, of course, heirs property. So if you could please explain that issue to us and share how you see agriculture fitting in with civil rights lawyering, an issue that's already come up a couple of times. I'll hand it to you, Monica.
Thank you. Good evening, and thank you again, Emily, for that introduction. I am honored to join two amazing lawyers, Sherri and Stephen, in this panel discussion this evening. I want to thank the Vermont Law School and the Center for Agriculture and Food Systems for hosting this timely series on embedded racism in the law. In this moment of pandemic and protest, I appreciate the opportunity for honest dialogue and a call to action on racial equity in the food system. As Emily said, I currently serve as the Director of Land Retention and Advocacy for the Federation of Southern Cooperatives Land Assistance Fund. I am very grateful for so many experiences which prepared me to lead at the Federation of Southern Cooperatives, one of the nation's oldest and largest organizations representing Black farmers. For over 53 years, the Federation, which was born out of the civil rights movement, has fought for Black farmers to have a fair opportunity to just feed their families and their communities. I want to thank the law students who are joining us this evening. Law school is such an extraordinary time to discover your life's purpose. As I think back on my first year of law school at the University of Florida, I learned of an opportunity for a summer internship at the Federation in Atlanta, Georgia. This opportunity would introduce me to the issue of Black land loss and the injustices against Black farmers and landowners at the hands of the USDA. As one of my farmer friends from Mississippi says quite often, it lit a fire in my belly. And I knew that I had found the right opportunity, but it wasn't the right time. I would finish my law degree and go on to do a master's of law degree. And in 1999, the Federation they called again and asked if I wanted to do a one-year fellowship to run its Georgia field office. Now, this was a very pivotal time for me, and it was the beginning of the Pigford lawsuit. And we're going to talk a lot about Pigford here tonight and its role in developing a more fair and equitable farm and food system. But when I took that fellowship for 1 year, I can recall organizing farmers and traveling to Washington, D.C. with busloads of farmers to protest injustices against Black farmers. During those all-night trips on cramped buses, I recall singing freedom songs, chanting "fired up, ready to go." And every person on that bus literally preparing and committing themselves to possibly being arrested at these protests. There is power in protest. During that time, I heard some of the stories of farmers who faced abusive and illegal discrimination by the USDA. I heard of farmers who were spit on in USDA offices, who had their loan applications torn up and trashed in their presence. Loan applications that were delayed and eventually denied. These systemic practices would go on for decades at the USDA. And I could never forget the stories and the struggles that many of those farmers shared. And so it was 9 years ago that I got another call from the Federation, this time asking me to consider a leadership role in the organization. And it was the right time. And I did feel that fire in my belly that just wouldn't go away. So I transitioned from private law practice back to the Federation to pursue my life's work and call for social justice and civil rights for Black farmers and landowners. And wow, I couldn't have landed at a better organization. The Federation had a reputation for meeting racial injustice head on, and this meant confronting the USDA at critical moments of history. Like in the 1980s, when we were at the height of the farm crisis and systemic racism by the USDA that drove thousands of Black farmers off their land. The Federation was the first to propose one of a kind Minority Farmers' Rights Act in 1985. The Federation would advocate for critical credit reforms in the Agricultural Act of 1987. These reforms would continue to establish a foundation of equity and inclusion at the USDA. And they also led to the 1990 Farm Bill, which we know today as the 2501 Technical Assistance and Outreach Program for socially disadvantaged farmers and ranchers. Despite these major reforms at the USDA and in federal law, Black farmers continue to lose land at an alarming rate. So the question tonight, what has caused Black land loss throughout the last 100 years, is a large question. Pickford is only part of the story. The story of race and the USDA starts with the crisis of Black land loss. And although the government never followed through on its promise of 40 acres and a mule that Sherri speaks of, Americans were able to amass over 15 million acres by 1910. Today, sadly, Black farmers have lost nearly 90% of the land they once owned. Most of it can be attributable to the impact of structural racism and inequities. The Federation sought to address this history of racism and inequities in 2018 when it helped to write the first sweeping legislation addressing heirs property issues. Now, heirs property is an issue that occurs in a disproportionate way among Black farmers and landowners. You see, when a person dies without a will or a succession plan, the land is often passed on to members of the family who become tenants in common. They own the property, but without the proper proof of ownership and clear title that is needed to sometimes access many of the programs at the USDA and other governmental agencies. Their land, unlike most farmers, has no collateral value. And so in times of crisis and pandemics, they are unable to leverage the land equity to stabilize their farming operations. So in 2018, the Farm Bill sought to address these inequities against Black farmers and particularly Ayers property owners by establishing additional documentation for Ayers property owners to access USDA programs and provide proof of ownership of the land that they were farming. But the key part of that legislation was a Ayers Relinding Fund, which would establish a way for Ayers property farmers to clear their title and leverage the capital assets in their land to stabilize their farming operations. We're 17 months into the Farm Bill cycle, and sadly, we have not yet had the Ayers Property Relinding Fund implemented. And many farmers are suffering today because they don't have those resources that are needed to clear their title and to leverage those assets during this pandemic. So I'm going to stop right there because I know we'll dig into this a little bit further as we get into our discussion questions.
Thank you, Monica. Yeah, just like our other two panelists, you've raised a huge range of really important issues, and I think it's hard to know what to dig into more first, but one of the really common themes that seems to be coming up is the importance of land ownership for farmers, for creating generational wealth, for being able to access operating capital, for maintaining farms. And a question, I'm actually going to start a little bit early with questions from the audience, because one of the questions that has come in is about the Pigford case and asks in particular, you know, $50,000 may be a nice sum, but it's not restoration of farmland. And why was that not a possibility in the Pigford cases? And how instead was the dollar figure of $50,000 determined?
I'll take a crack at that. Though I was not a part of the actual negotiations which led to the settlement, I started working. It doesn't come close to repairing the lives of people who farmed and tried to farm. One of the things that was hard, I think, when people tried to negotiate out what to do, was that it was very difficult to distinguish people who had suffered really terrible harms or people where the damages were more modest. And so the idea was that that's where a class makes sense. But in a class is as a rougher form of justice, in that you're going to inevitably homogenize people. Some, you know, the folks who, and there were some, you know, who had thousands of acres and lost them due to discrimination, get sort of dumped in the same pool as somebody who tried to get started and could never get a loan. Both suffered catastrophic losses in a certain way, but our legal system would assign very different dollar values to both those losses. So what happened when the negotiations was they decided to do a number for successful claimants who went through this process to show discrimination, and then it became a negotiation. And my understanding, from not firsthand knowledge, but talking to people who were involved in negotiations, is they came close to settling on a much lower number. And one of the lawyers, now passed away, J.L. Chestnut from Alabama, basically said, hey, you lose a farm and you're a white person, no one offers you $25,000 or $20,000 or 10. Let's have a real number here. Let's do 50,000. And actually, that's ended up as of course that's ended up to being what happened. And so I think the answer to the question is it was a negotiation, and there are a lot, I would say there are a lot of problems with this case, but it did move $1 billion, and in each of the two black farmer cases moved $1 billion, and with a sort of rough kind of justice in the right direction. And you can criticize it in many, many important ways for not going far enough. And in my mind, you would be correct.
And I can add a little bit to that. I was actually, I'm sorry, go ahead. I can't see anybody now, so.
Go, Sherri.
Okay. I was actually at USDA during the time that those claims were being made, and farmers had two options, but it still didn't replace the land. They could either go for A track or B track, and in B track they could opt out and try to prove a larger amount of loss if they had the documentation. The challenge was with many of the farmers who filed during that time, the Farm Service Agency every 5 years destroyed all of the previous applications. So because the lawsuit covered so many years, there were so many years of application materials that farmers had filed with their local Farm Service, the county committees, and that documentation no longer existed. So many of the farmers settled for the 50,000 rather than trying to go the route of trying to prove that they should have been entitled to so much more. But again, that still did not replace the land that they had already lost, because oftentimes that land had been purchased by some of the same people or the members of families of those same people who sat on those county committees making the decisions about whether they got the loan or not originally from the Farm Service Agency.
And I just want to jump in and add also that Pickford was historic. I mean, for the first time, the USDA actually acknowledged its role in discriminating and causing many of the Black farmers to be driven off of their land. So it was historic in that way, but inadequate in so many other ways. There's no way to truly address structural racism unless you create some type of structural remedy or solution. And our focus as an organization has always been on the legal policy and reform that is necessary to racism. And, you know, the $50,000 was a drop in the bucket for families who lost hundreds of acres, their family legacy. And so we have to focus on legal policy and reform, which will address the structural racism in it with a structural remedy and provide a way to restore the land base of these African-American families who have lost really their inheritance and their family's legacy.
Thank you. I think that's a great segue, I think, into a question that's been sort of percolating in my mind around coming from the Pickford cases, but more generally, what do you all see as the role of litigation as a tool for dismantling structural racism in agriculture or in the food system? What can it do well? What are its limits?
I'd like to start on that one if I could. And I think this is an especially good question for students. You know, I know that there are students out there facing a difficult road ahead as lawyers, and I want to just reaffirm for them, it is possible to do good work in this world, and that work can be rural, it can be urban, it can be agricultural, and you can have a good life and do the work, really, really good work. It's going to be a bit of an uphill struggle, but stick with it, because the world needs you to really be at the forefront of providing legal assistance in a struggle for justice. And so, you know, don't get discouraged. Don't go to Wall Street. Well, go to Wall Street if you want, but don't go to Wall Street. Stay in your community. Sorry, Wall Street. There's a fight out there, and you have a role in it. So the thing that I would say for litigation, I would recommend strongly, if you haven't read part of it in your law school, read Gerry Lopez's Rebellious Lawyering. And what Gerry Lopez and other people talk about is it's possible to do litigation, to be a lawyer. And what you do, you really, really emphasize working with grassroots organizations of your clients, of people affected. The best legal strategy, the best litigation strategy is the one that is driven by grassroots farm organizations of Black farmers who have the problems, that know what they need. And you're not the lawyer, you're not in charge. You take direction from them and leverage your skills through an organization. Use lay advocates, train people to help other people to know their rights. So, and never forget that every litigation is also political. There wouldn't have been a Pickford case were it not for Congress waiving the statute of limitations to allow the case to go forward. And that only happened because of protests, because of activism by primarily the Congressional Black Caucus. So I feel like there's a great opportunity for legal work and for litigation. I just think that this sort of, well, as you're at Vermont Law School, you're familiar with environmental and other organizations that have a very top-down view of litigation. We're smarter than everybody else. Let's go file a lawsuit. That's not what I recommend. I recommend pitching yourself to people who are fighting on the ground for their rights.
And as a Black lawyer,
thanks, Stephen.
go ahead.
Sherri, do you want to go ahead?
I'm flying blind, so you'll have to let me know when it's time. I can't see anyone at this point. That's the problem with broadband in rural North Carolina. I would say that I would piggyback on what Stephen had to say. One of the biggest settlements in North Carolina was a Title VI settlement relative to contamination from CAFOs, or concentrated animal feeding operations here. And that lawsuit was filed on behalf of a nonprofit organization on which I sit, the board on which I sit, REACH, the North Carolina Environmental Justice Network, which is a organization of nonprofits across the state interested in environmental justice issues, and the Waterkeeper Foundation here. And that settlement, while it wasn't everything the community wanted, resulted in some reforms at the Department of Environmental Quality. But had the communities not risen up to fight, nothing would have really changed. And every day it's a fight here because as lawyers, you have to realize that the industry is very powerful. It is political, and they have the money to support the politicians that are in office to get what they want, more so than the community does. But if you can get that wellspring of communities who come together to fight together, you can get a victory every now and then, and it's worth every second when that happens.
Thanks, Sherri. Monica, I think you had something to add as well.
Yeah, power concedes nothing without a demand. And as a Black lawyer, I understand the importance of litigation. Even during the civil rights movement, many of the changes and the successes we had were because of Dr. King's ability to leverage lawsuits and to utilize Black lawyers in particular to file those lawsuits and to argue those lawsuits on behalf of the aggrieved parties. And so, we recognize that as lawyers, we're often in a position to give voice to the voiceless. And I think it was Charles Houston, one of the famous attorneys of the civil rights movement, who said, a lawyer who is not a social engineer is simply a parasite on his community. And so I often think of that even in my own work, and why it is so important that there are lawyers of color who can lead this work and who can represent our marginalized communities in a way that they wouldn't otherwise have the ability to give voice.
Thank you, Monica. And I know and you also introduced that the Federation also does a lot of work in advocacy for legislative reform. So could you maybe speak a little bit to how you see that playing into affecting change as well?
Yes, well, the advocacy role is a significant role. The Federation has always been able to advocate for legislative changes, and I referred back to some of our early wins, the Agricultural Act, Credit Act of 1987, the 1990 Farm Bill, which would become the impetus behind the 2501 program today. And those things don't get done unless there are organizations out on the front line and working directly with members of Congress to make those things happen. Even in 2018, when we were able to advocate for the successful passage of the Ayers property legislation, those things require constant education about what Ayers property is. It's not a problem that's familiar to most lawmakers. So working across party lines even to educate lawmakers, because we were able to get bipartisan support for the Ayers property legislation. And we had introduction on the Senate side from Senator Tim Scott and Senator Doug Jones of Alabama. So that really is a testament to the effectiveness of being able to advocate successfully, as the Federation has done over the years, and get legislation passed. But clearly in that, as Stephen has mentioned, the Congressional Black Caucus has been a stalwart in this work, and being able to really elevate the voice of Black farmers and ensure that there are policies which reflect equity and inclusion at the USDA from a federal level.
Thank you. Speaking of USDA, we've talked about several examples of the harms of structural racism within USDA programs, past and present. What do you think it will take to effect change in those programs?
Are you referring that question back to me?
It's for anyone, but Monica, you were the first one who looked excited to answer it. And then Stephen will go.
Well, I think the legal policy and reform must focus on how we restore a land-based base to African Americans, and how we provide both the financial resources to clear up heirs property issues, and also the technical assistance and education that's necessary. Oftentimes, when our farmers go into a USDA office, they don't get the same treatment as their white counterparts for one reason or another. And there is a gap oftentimes found in the servicing of Black farmers. And organizations, community-based organizations like the Federation of Southern Cooperatives, we feel an important gap for those farmers. We are able to help them navigate the complexities of oftentimes just applying for a program or learning about a program. So there is a critical role that community-based organizations play when it comes to the success and viability of Black farmers. And so we're thankful that
the USDA has recognized the significance of leveling the playing field and providing that technical assistance and outreach to Black farmers to increase their chances of being successful. Because in many of these counties, they're still dealing with the vestiges of that old plantation, as Stephen referred to, that as the USDA is often referred to. But there has to be progressive and intentional steps taken to ensure that Black farmers can be successful, because we believe that there are opportunities to be successful if there are targeted programs which will invest in Black farmers being more successful.
Thank you. Stephen?
Thanks. Yes, I have two specific things if we're talking right now about USDA in particular. This year, the taxpayers through USDA are going to send farmers over $30 billion. Almost none of that money is going to go someplace where it's very intentionally designed to help people who actually struggle. It's very largely correlated to the size of the operation, which is an excellent way to have sort of an objective system, but that penalizes people by race and class, to be quite frank about it. And what this society needs to do is say, if we're going to give $30 billion to farmers, we want that money spent well, spent fairly. We don't want people to sort of pretend like just dropping money out of an airplane is going to help everybody equally. It won't. And so if you're not intentional in designing programs that are going to benefit folks who are African-American farmers, direct marketers, what people call specialty crops, fruits and vegetables, you think it through. It's would be complicated. It's not impossible to figure out ways that wouldn't even look like affirmative action. They would just be looking like we're trying to help farmers who are feeding people, not supplying grain for pork in China. And I don't mean to be snide, but that's where a lot of this money goes, is to large grain farms. And there's a good use for grain, but let's not pretend that's what feeds people, or in particular poor people or hungry people. And let's not pretend that those operations are of a modest size where somebody is struggling to really, really make a living. The big money goes to big farms. And if you redirected that money, you would help both white farmers of modest means, and you would especially help African-American farmers. So I would like to spend the same amount of money, just do it better. The second thing that I would say in particular about USDA is that if you're going to have farm programs, you are going to need to have an actual anti-discrimination policy. As a bare bones minimum, it has to be that if somebody feels discriminated against, there's a place for them to go, which will investigate the complaint, will actually look at what has happened and have the power to do something about it. And what's happened in the past, again, this is no exaggeration, the anti-discrimination programs at USDA have been essentially symbolic. So it's actually even worse than not having one, because all it does is invite people to think, well, see, they're trying, they're working, and it was a sham. It would take money to have a real anti-discrimination policy at USDA. You would take resources. You would take committed people. You would take a secretary that cared about it. And even then, it will take a long time before you win back the faith of people who've been so harmed by that department. So if we want to have a USDA, it's a fair and just USDA, they need to start now to treat people fairly. And they have to expect that everybody's not going to jump up and down and clap over the fact that they do a few things correctly. And I know that's not what USDA people want to hear, but USDA claims to be frustrated because Black farmers don't participate in the programs. Well, I wonder why, right? And it's a long road. It has to start now, or maybe it's like the police. You should just figure out a different path. I don't know.
Stephen brings up a very good point. I have always argued that the definition that the USDA uses for small farms is totally out of whack. In USDA definition, a small farm comprises any farm that makes $250,000 or less. No small farmer that I know, and I grew up working on a farm, makes that kind of money. And I want to throw some figures out for you to think about. White people own about 97% of non-farming land, but generate about 98% of farm-related income. Just think about that number. We have farmers, Black farmers in comparison, own about 3% of non-farming land and have less than 4% of the farms that are in the United States right now. There is a huge disparity. I see it every day in rural North Carolina. The farm subsidies are coming to the big farmers that have the big grain farms, while the small farmers are struggling every day just to make ends meet. Something has to change with the paradigm and the way that USDA looks at the farming system that they set up many, many years ago. And setting up an office of disadvantaged business or the 2501 program doesn't address all of the ills that currently exist.
Thank you. We're starting to get several more questions coming in from the audience. So I'm going to take another one in just a minute, but we've talked quite a bit about the importance of land, but even with some kind of program or initiative to make it more feasible for more African American farmers to go back to the land, to own land. There are a lot of African Americans who aren't necessarily coming to the land with, with a personal history of farming experience or with a recent family history, sometimes because their family had lost land through these various types of discrimination that we've been talking about. So what do you think of the kind of small community-based efforts that try to engage Black farmers or Indigenous or other people of color in farmer training and land access? Do you think that those efforts can be impactful, or are the legal or other barriers too high at this point?
You want to start, Monica?
Yeah, sure. I think those efforts are very important. Land access is a very big issue, especially for new and beginning farmers, given the rising price of land values. And, I go back to, for most farmers, land is the largest asset on their balance sheet. And so they are able to leverage that land to support themselves and stabilize their farming operations, even when there are times of economic downturn. And so to me, that just underscores the value of having the land, holding the land, being able to access the land. But I think, we have to talk about access to land sort of with access to credit, because those are really two things that are inseparable. Credit is the lifeblood for most farmers. And the reality is most new and beginning Black farmers will have to resort to lending through FSA. And after 7 years, most of those farmers are going to basically graduate out of that lending structure. And there are few places for those farmers to even go once they sort of move out of that structure. So we've got to really think about creating more sustainable streams of credit for new and beginning farmers of color, and thinking about those farmers and the challenges they have in terms of either access to land or land retention if they're farming on family-owned land. But I think the local efforts are definitely necessary to ensure that we preserve working agricultural lands. But we've also got to think about ensuring that these farmers have a reliable source of credit, and that credit is going to remain available to them after 7 years.
I could not agree more. As some people may know, there's actually a fair number of beginning farmer programs. They go by somewhat different names, and USDA has funded some of these programs. And I think by and large, they're a very good idea, sort of help people that are interested, they're just getting going, to understand certain things so they have a better chance to succeed. But the danger with those is that you send people through a class, get their hopes up, and just kind of toss them to the wolves. And not to be disparage wolves, but I mean, it's a tough place out there to try to farm, and a tough place to start out. And land is almost impossible to buy sometimes. And if you have any further disadvantages, it's a struggle. And a beginning farmer class, however good it is, doesn't change the rest of the landscape. And so I think they're great. I think one of the things that we must do is experiment with different forms of land ownership. There's a lot of interest now in land trusts. The most famous beginning land trust was, of course, New Communities, founded in Georgia by African Americans involved in the civil rights movement, trying to establish a place on the land and to be able to farm for the long term. And those sorts of cooperative, interesting ownership efforts, it seems to me we have to think about, and put funding towards them. For more, this is the part where this is going to sound way out there, but to me, there may be no other choice. If we really want to turn this around, there's no substitute for giving people access to land and not burdening them with overwhelming amount of debt. In this country, I don't mean to be kind of over the top here, but if you go to our richest 1% of the population, they've got $25 trillion of net assets. If we just went to the 0.1 richest percent of the population, did a very small wealth tax, you could put lands in the hands of tens of thousands of people who've been historically disadvantaged and give them a chance to farm. That's something that would make a go, to my mind, at turning this around. And at the same time, you'd have to support institutions which will provide them support, provide education. It turns out that agricultural extension is very good at their job, and so are the researchers if they have the right goals, the right assignment, and are researching the right topics. Let's help people farm on a small scale to serve markets and help people of color, but give them a legitimate shot. And I don't think we can do it on the cheap. I think we're talking about real resources.
And can I just follow up really quickly? Can I just follow up really quickly on that? I think the other side of that coin is the land access problem, but I think the other side of that coin is the land utilization problem. In the Black Belt counties alone of the South, it's estimated that there are 1.6 million acres in Ayers property. This is land that is totally unutilized. And I would argue that that is a reservoir of potential untapped wealth in those communities that could be really cultivated to bring new economic resources to those communities. And this is why our policy focus was on having something like the Ayers Property Relinding Fund, which would allow farm families to resolve their land issues and put that agricultural land to work. We know that probably over the next 20 years, about half of all agricultural lands are going to change hands because farmers are aging out and that farm land is going to transition. And if we don't put policies in place now to start addressing heirs property, particularly among Black farmers, then we're going to exacerbate the problem of land underutilization.
Thanks, Monica. And I want to follow up on some of the ownership structure questions or issues, but I first wanted to get in a question that's come in about heirs property. And particularly, could you speak a little bit, Monica, to what the Relinding program does and how that could address some of the issues that you've just raised?
Yes. So the heirs property relending program in the Farm Bill was designed to provide financial resources for farmers who were farming on heirs property to resolve their heirs property issues by clearing title, so accessing the legal resources necessary to clear their title, but also allowing those farmers to get their own farm succession plan. And so what we realize is that when farmers are farming on heirs property, many of the decisions have to involve all of the heirs. Now, if that's a group of 2 or 3, not as problematic, but that's not what we see here at the Federation. We work with groups who number sometimes 50, 75, over 100. And it's near impossible for a farmer to be able to farm and have to rely on every decision being made by all of the heirs involved. So the heirs property relending piece is an attempt to let that farmer free himself from the other heirs by seeking a loan to purchase the interest of all heirs involved outright, so that the farmer now clears the title to the land, but is able to manage and operate that farm with the autonomy of a sole decision maker. Now, this program has received congressional funding at an appropriation rate of $5 million. So we're just waiting on the USDA to complete the regulatory process. And we're hopeful that that process will be completed by the end of this year. We know that there has been some delay with the coronavirus and having additional layers of compliance and regulation, as the lending rule was deemed a significant rule by the USDA. But this has to get done. We're 17 months into the Farm Bill cycle. Farm Bill happens every 5 years or so. And so this will be a significant hollow victory if we don't get this program rolled out, because as I get the call every day of farm families who are waiting to start addressing their heirs property issues if they had the resources to do so. And they need to be able to leverage their land resources right now during this pandemic to be able to stay afloat.
Yeah, and it sounds like that delay in action is probably also feeding into some of the same trust problems with the agency that we've seen play out over the years.
Absolutely, the historic, as Stephen referred to, sort of delay and then deny, and basically kind of farmers finding themselves in a position where they mistrust the USDA.
I do want to get into some of the issues that have started to be raised around COVID and how that plays out. But first, I also want to get back to a question that's come in from the audience that's related to these issues of shared ownership structures. And this viewer asks, do you have any opinions on converting lands to commons ownership structures so they could be co-managed by various Black communities, and perhaps the commons land could be given in reparation. Thoughts on that?
So as a purely legal matter, there's no reason why that can't work. I would think that the resources would be well spent if you use some sort of an easement that stripped the development value out of that land. And so then you have a cooperative or somewhat communal structure and organization, but it can no longer ever be used for a housing development. It's not a get-rich scheme. It's not for developers. It's for Black farmers. And let them run it. Let people organize themselves. But again, we bump up against money. And I mean, it's this dilemma, the dialectic of if you get close into metropolitan area and buy good land, you have to compete against developers. Land's incredibly expensive. If you go way out, it's hard to get a market and hard to make any other living. And so, you know, unless you're going to be a fairly large commodity person, you have to be able to buy land that on a straight fair market value is expensive. And I think that's true whether you're just going to be smallish or whether you're going to do cooperative ownership. And I mean, I love the idea of people coming together and developing alternative models. I mean, it's in this country, there's sort of gives some people the shivers to think about owning land cooperatively, but I think it's a great idea. But it's getting the access to the land on a longer term is expensive.
What about Sherri or Monica? Thoughts about this idea? Are there potential problems with trying to farm in that way, and with some of the issues to have access to credit that you've raised earlier?
I think it's a good question. I'm not sure, and I always put on my rural hat when I'm thinking about things like this. And oftentimes in rural areas, there's not that much of an opportunity because again, with the Ayers property situation, oftentimes that land has already been sold because there was disagreements among the Ayers to that property. And so there may not be property available to purchase to create a collaborative or cooperative of that nature. I would love to see those kinds of things happen here. But in many ways, it would be very difficult because it's very industrialized because of all of the CAFOs that we have in this part of the country, especially in rural areas.
And I would just
Monica,
add to that as an organization, we encourage individual owners to use their land at the highest and best use. We advocate for local control and ownership of infrastructure resources. So I guess, you know, that in some ways may kick against a lot of the collective ownership models that we're seeing. But as an organization, we really value local ownership and control of infrastructure, as well as community-supported agricultural systems. So in that sense, we think that the community is more resilient when landowners are able to build and leverage their own land assets. And not to say that these other models don't work, but we think that there is some importance to having local control and local ownership of those land resources.
Monica, do you think that the mechanisms are in place to solve sort of Ayers property problems one by one if the resources are available?
Yes, I absolutely do.
Well, that's never been true before. I hope people understand what a big deal it is that you've been able to accomplish, to have a path to get that land out of that uncertainty and into hands where people can develop it further, feel secure about being able to pass it on, and so forth.
Well, Stephen, as we know, most of the wealth in this country is based on land ownership. It's the American dream. And, this whole idea that African Americans don't really want to own land, that is, to me, is flawed logic. What people don't want to own land and build their own resilience. So, yes, we have to create policies which create a path for Black landowners to be able to use their land just the same way their white counterpart and neighbor want to use their land. So, I oftentimes hear that logic being stated that perhaps African Americans don't really want to.
Making pledges over the phone.
And I think that is further from the truth than anything I've ever heard.
Everybody who says that should be forced to go read W.E.B. Du Bois's book about Reconstruction and about the role that the desire for land played as the central aim for those folks who had been enslaved. Forced to go read.
Absolutely.
I want to emphasize.
Thanks. We're getting it.
Okay, I think we're going to cut out there and run.
Hi. Yes, there is some more to the video presentation, and I want to make you aware that we have recorded this session, and we will provide links, information, so that you can see the entire presentation in a day or two. But I want to thank everyone for coming, for joining us this evening. As Donna mentioned at the beginning, this is the third event in our climate justice series. If you were unable to attend the first two sessions, there's information on our website that will enable you to see them. Sorry. Okay, a little distraction there. Where was I? Oh, the website. You can go see the first two sessions, information about those. We obviously can't have a Q&A with the presenters, although interesting. Reverend Nancy Wright asked a question about why I think it was the Ayers Property Fund hadn't been implemented yet, and Monica actually answered that question in her responses, that there are regulatory issues, and she also said something related to COVID. And we got at least a thumbs up for Stephen's recommendation for a wealth tax as a way to maybe distribute some of the money and get people some land. But although we don't have questions and answers for the presenters, we can have, and I hope we can have, a discussion among ourselves about this presentation. I am, for the man of administration, I'm going to try to limit this so that we don't all talk at once. And I'm going to ask that if you have something to say, raise your hand and I'll call upon you. Some of you folks who are don't have your video on, I won't be able to see you, so you're going to either have to unmute yourself or make yourself visible. I guess the question that I have right now is, what do people have to say about what they have heard? What are your thoughts? What are your reactions to the material that was covered?
First time I'd ever heard of it in this detail.
Yes, I would agree. I've never this is a learning process. I was really amazed when I first saw this at how much I didn't know.
Really? Yeah.
Going on.
Yeah. There was a real whole field of of American experience that I wasn't aware of.
Best history class I've sat in on in 40 years. So
Good. I'm glad we were able to help.
yep.
I wish I could have talked with Stephen about the connection between race and agriculture in Vermont, because there's a big connection. There's a good book done by Teresa Mares of UVM called Life on the Other Border. And it's about the experience of migrant justice and about immigrant farm workers, I should say, struggling in Vermont within the context of fear and oppression and a fear of ICE, separation from their families and the like. It's really a good book.
Harris, did you have something you wanted to say?
I imagine that. Am I on my voice on?
Yes, you are. We can hear you.
Clear.
I imagine that having more smaller farms and a different form of agriculture would be a benefit for climate change, and the connection between perhaps the large farms and motions. But I didn't get a rationale for. I didn't hear them talk about that particular aspect.
I think that's really right on, and I think we need to work toward that in Vermont. We have huge farms here that are trashing the land and polluting the water and producing too much milk and running themselves into the ground. It's just we need a different model of agriculture here, so it would be great if we could get some smaller farms out of some of these larger ones that may be phased out. I don't know.
I think we've all been aware that this industrial farming, industrial food system that addresses most of our food needs is really damaging to the environment and the climate. Pastor Nancy?
Yeah.
We can't hear you.
Someone's trying to speak.
I'm wondering if Reverend Rachel Field is within hearing distance and could, contribute to this conversation since she is working a farm.
Yep, Nancy, yeah, I was unmuting but have my video off. Yeah, so a couple things came to mind. One, the power of small farms to sink carbon and actually reverse the effects of climate change is something that I think maybe even unknowingly set up in our last part of this series when we learned about soil health and how small regenerative farms can actually reverse the effects of climate change by grazing management and by not tilling and by growing a wide diversity of crops. And then the other thing I'd say about that which connects it to this talk a little bit more is that a lot of the tenets of regenerative farming or permaculture systems, all this are actually principles that are direct carryover from many indigenous forms of agriculture that have been around for tens of thousands of years that folks have been doing. So we're really, this farming revolution that we're looking at to get back to these small farms that can reverse the effects of climate change, we're actually relying a lot on the wisdom of indigenous farmers and traditional agriculture in a whole different sense.
Great.
I was going to ask you, Rachel, if you could share a little bit about Mission Farm and the project there that you and the Reverend Lisa Ransom are working on, if you wouldn't mind.
Sure. Yeah, thanks, Donna. Yeah, Mission Farm is a 180-acre community of land in the Killington area, and it's just a fascinating case study, and I think a lot of the things that came up in this panel discussion, we haven't been able to find out the history of how this family got this farm, but there was a colonial family that ended up owning the farm, and it was donated to the Episcopal Church, all 180 acres, for the purpose that it be used by a farmer who is a priest as well. So Lisa Ransom, who owns Grow Compost and is an Episcopal priest, and myself, I work on my small 13-acre farm at home, and I'm also an Episcopal priest. We're working together to reimagine Mission Farm as a regenerative farm. So we'll be doing, we're building up the infrastructure now to have organic vegetables, pasture-raised meats, and we have a bakery on site. So we'll be working with our foods to produce the food that we grow to produce prepared foods for others. But what is really central to this exploration and thinking about what kind of systems we put on the land at Mission Farm is asking questions about not only what is present now and what has happened in the last 400 years since colonial contact, but what is the history of the land before that? How is this land a part of the Abenaki tribe that moved through the area? And we've been learning a bit about how the Abenaki would have and still would rely on waterways as places of gathering and movement, and there's a river that goes right through our property. So we're learning about the history of the people on the land is helping us to learn about what might be invited in terms of programming or agriculture on the land now. So it's really kind of fascinating.
Great. Good to know that something like that is underway, and hopefully will bring forth some benefits not only to the local community in terms of food, but also carbon sequestration. Anyone else have questions or comments?
Yeah, I had a couple of things. One is, I think that it was 100 years ago or more when there were a lot more farms in Vermont owned by Black Americans. And unfortunately, I think they were driven off their land. I know in Heinsberg, there was a community up on what we now call Lincoln Hill, but I think it was called something different then. But I think maybe that's turning around to some extent, at least now. I think there are organizations, and maybe Vermont Land Trust is one of them, and maybe there's others, that are trying to pair people who want to farm with farmers who are ready to retire, and trying to match them, and so that new farmers can get a start. And I'm not sure if there's actually resources to help new farmers financially. I think there are some, and hopefully there's more coming. But I did hear, I wish I could remember her name. I'm sorry I can't, but I did hear of one Black woman who I think has recently been able to get farmland, and I believe she's going to have a vineyard, if I remember correctly. So that's a start anyway.
Thank you for that, Betsy. And I'll bring attention, if you haven't seen it, Reverend Rachel has put a link in the chat for a resource that I believe it's called the Soul Fire Farm, which is a Black-owned farm.
Yep, that's right, Ron. And I just would highlight Leah Penniman from Soulfire Farm is really pioneering a lot of the practical things that were mentioned on the panel tonight. And she's not that far away over in New York.
Okay.
There's also Susu, S-U-S-U, right? Rachel, you know. It's in the Brattleboro area.
Right. Yep, that's
like
right.
a collective of Black women who are engaged in healing practices and hope to purchase land and have a CSA to benefit the community.
And there's the Clemens Family Farm in Charlotte.
Yeah, right. Great to hear your voice, Betsy.
Yeah, glad to have you with us. Donna, did you have something you wanted to add?
Oh, I just, I mean, when I was listening to this the first time, and again recently, it brought to mind Vermont House Bill 478, which calls for a task force to study reparation proposals for African Americans. And while it doesn't specifically refer to land, certainly there's enough language in there and references to righting the wrongs in all forms that land would certainly be one of those. And I'm just wondering if anybody on the event tonight has any information about where that stands or anything else that maybe we could help get behind as an organization or as individuals personally.
Have you looked on the soulfire.org yet? The first thing that comes up is reparation for Black Indigenous farmers. So you might go there.
But she's in New York, so I wasn't sure if that would also connect with Vermont. But I mean, that's a great Pastor Nancy. Yeah. I appreciate that. I will definitely check that out.
I think Mark, I'm sorry, I think Mark Hughes of Justice for All might know the status of that legislation.
Yeah, he would definitely. Definitely, it's part of their platform.
Yeah. So you can look for Justice for All on the web or Mark Hughes.
Right. We're connected with Mark through the Vermont Racial Justice Alliance. We sponsor their program commemorating the 401st anniversary of the African landing here, and Pastor Nancy is involved as an active member, right, Pastor Nancy?
Yeah. Yes.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks.
Pam, did you have something you wanted to say? Just raising your fingers, huh? Okay. Okay.
Ron?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I was on mute. A couple of points going back to the beginning of our conversation. I had the same reaction that others did when I saw this the first time. I happened coincidentally to also be reading Isabel Wilkerson's book Cast, which is almost in the same way. There's a strong parallel in the sense that there are so many parts of our life that I had no clue of how pernicious racism had woven itself into the fabric of our nation's history and way of doing things. And it's really knocked me back on my heels, even though I've lived with the issue of racism all my adult life. That is really, this just grounds it. I mean, this discussion of the details of how federal and state policies just made it impossible for people of color to prosper in this part of life where so many of them lived up until the middle of the 20th century. And I guess the second point I was going to make is only vaguely related, but it goes to the breadth and depth of the issue, is that there is the Vermont Public Health Association is also having its annual conference and an evening webinar, and the focus of it is going to be racism in Vermont as a public, as in public health. And Reverend Arnold is going, Pastor Arnold's going to be the keynote speaker. If you're interested in seeing that, it's December 3rd, and you can register for it on the Vermont Public Health Association website. But those are my comments.
Thank you, Sam. And I just want to kind of reiterate also Donald's initial comment about a history lesson. I mean, this is all information that I think is new to all of us, but it's also something that has been part of our lives and our history for years and years. And it's part of the process of addressing this issue is to learn and understand what has happened so that hopefully we can make progress going forward to change what we have created. It's after 9 o'clock. We've occupied more than 2 hours of your time. Are there any last questions or comments people want to share?
I just wanted to share briefly, Ron, that last night I participated, maybe someone else on the call or event did as well last night, in the Racism in America forum that Pastor Arnold Thomas facilitated. And this reference to education and what was left out of the history books was kind of a key concluding moment in the conversation, and especially in response to the question, is there a path to racial reconciliation in America? That, you know, we got to, this information, this history, which is American history, it's not just Black American history, right? This needs to get into classrooms from kindergarten through higher education and of course, non-formal education like we're doing this evening. So it's great that we can have these fora and times to get together and then follow up and see what we could do either with our organization or affiliated organizations, or as Sam mentioned, with the public health event coming up next week. There's so many opportunities. And Ron, I don't know if you were going to mention next Monday, our national IPL has an event that we're co-sponsoring that just takes all of this further. Did you want to mention anything?
I don't have the specifics of that. Do you have it?
Sure, yeah. So the title is Drawdown, which we've all heard a lot about probably. And, you know, drawdown, of course, is the concept of healthy soils being able to sequester carbon and thus help to mitigate climate change. So there is going to be an event, a Zoom event, maybe not be Zoom, but it's virtual next Monday, November 16th. And that is on our Facebook page as well as on our website. And it's largely for congregations to help learn more about what they can do, faith communities to be part of the Drawdown movement, which has really gotten a lot of attention lately. And that was also a large part of the focus of the film Kiss the Ground, which was our last event in late October. So that was all I wanted to say.
Well, it kind of draws it all together in terms of the issues of land, farming, racial justice, and climate justice, which is the theme of what we have, the series we've had.
I'd like to say one more thing, if I may.
Go ahead, Betsy.
Okay. I just want to say thank you so much for doing this. And I know that many of you and many of the people here are on the board of Vermont Interfaith Power and Light, but not all of you are. And I think Donna said she is going to put a link to the program into the next Vermont Interfaith Power and Light newsletter. And hopefully those of you who aren't on the board are receiving the newsletter. And if you thought this was worthwhile, I hope you'll share it with others. So it goes beyond just the current Vermont Interfaith Power and Light network. And yeah, spread it farther. Thank you.
Thank you, Betsy. And I'll point out too that if you're not receiving the Interfaith Power and Light newsletter, go to our website and there's a link, a symbol where you can sign up and we'll add you to
I just wanted to say thank you all for doing this.
Well, thank you. Thank you for being with us and thank you for sharing. Appreciate it. Can we say good night?
Good night.
Good night.
Thank you.
Thanks again.
Thank you very much.